In this 1993 movie, the government has prohibited all bad words in order to protect people from feeling offended, to protect their sensitivities, and has banned meat and any real police. In order to deal with a powerful criminal who has conspiratorially been brought back from the past, now that they do not use and do not know how to use force,
we're police officers. We're not trained to handle this kind of violence.
They bring back a police officer from the past as well. Although at the time the film was released, 1993, there already was political correctness, the situation portrayed in the film does predict the results of political correctness and the sensitive mentality. Many wish to see red meat prohibited. The state has attempted to interfere with how big people's sodas can be. Advertising unhealthy bacon and butter has been banned in London's underground. It is believed by many that free speech should be banned if they consider it to be hate speech, and even the mere mention of a fact may be considered insensitive or offensive enough to one group or another so as to deserve to be banned. Speeches of conservative speakers have been cancelled by calling the speaker a Nazi, the speaker being a Jewish homosexual who married his black boyfriend. A presidential candidate's speech was cancelled through use of violence, committed by people who acted notoriously insensitively and offensively. Students demand certain Halloween costumes be banned because they consider them offensive and responsible for cultural appropriation.
An exception is because other people have rights too, not just you.
Walk away. Walk away. Interfering in unsafe space here for all. Stay
deny-
quiet. By sending out that email, that goes against your position as master. Do you understand that? Then
No, I
stop.
don't agree with that.
Then why the did you accept the position?
Because
Who
I have
the
a-
hired you?
I have a different
You
vision
should
than you.
step down. If that is what you think about being a master, you should step down. You should not sleep at night. We're out. We out. You are disgusting.
In New York, misgendering a person, calling someone born a man but who feels he is a woman, he instead of she, incurs a $250,000 penalty. While in the United States these are limited instances in specific areas, in Europe, without the protection of a clear First Amendment, there are laws and directives banning speech that offends certain groups. But social media companies do ban people, often for no reason, but simply for disagreeing with the multicultural beliefs of the company, while people from the political side the companies approve of are allowed to say far worse. There are so-called safe spaces in universities where people are not allowed to say anything that may upset some students. For example, statements like, "I believe women do not earn less than men in the workplace when they do the exact same work," or "Arabs took more slaves from Africa and treated them even worse than whites did," or "I disagree with open borders," or "I disagree with transgender who were born boys participating in girls' sports." And lack of enforcement of laws or even abolition of laws has led San Francisco to becoming the capital of homelessness, drug addiction, human excrement on the streets, and finally facing epidemics like typhus, tuberculosis, and even a return to the Middle Ages with the bubonic plague. In the movie, the man leading the rebellion demands the right to eat hamburgers, smoke, and exercise free speech, say what he wants to say, but is not allowed to, as the entire city has become a safe space. He does not want the state to impose dogmas on his life. He expresses a moderate or even conservative view. Not conservative as in American Gothic, or what these people wanted, but conservative in this sense. He does not demand economic equality, racial equality, or gender equality. And he does not speak about racism, sexism, or homophobia. Thus, he has nothing to do with the left or multiculturalism. He considers society to have advanced beyond these issues, which are no longer problems and thus no longer relevant. The police officer, John Spartan, is rather like President Trump. He is a clownish, insensitive, uncouth loudmouth. Does this characterization apply to Trump? Check. He eats unhealthily and disregards conventions of propriety. Trump? Check. Trump can also be rude. Match?
Officer, return this man to cryostasis immediately. Be well.
Check. Today, people themselves promote politically correct authoritarianism, thus they favor the state, as the state is the one who imposes and enforces. An albino person demanded banning albino rhino beer in a restaurant because its name offended her. A person born a woman demands to be called by colleagues they, because this person feels to be both a man and a woman. In Fahrenheit 451, unlike the simplified movie which twisted the story into a simplistic authoritarianism by the state is bad message, something very true but also very obvious and easy to understand, making the film appropriate only for the mentally lazy, the book deals with a deeper problem that requires much more thought. Yes, the state has forbidden books, and firefighters try to find any hidden books in order to burn them, but it was the citizens themselves who first abandoned books. It is our fellow citizens who are our enemy. This is especially important in democratic countries, as it is the people themselves who, with their vote, facilitate any authoritarianism by the state. Moreover, the desire to protect the feelings of minorities is the initial cause of the book burnings and censorship. Easily offended complainers demanded censorship, although it is more sinister today, as it is the establishment itself that financially supports activist groups, and it is the media that the establishment super-rich elite own that promotes these complaints and encourages people to feel offended.
With its intent to drive minority students off of campus, already marginalized in a racist capitalist America.
My sexist, my racist, and my homophobic country.
Yes, I am angry today! And I'm hostile! But come and talk to me about it and deal with this anger that you made in me! Stop it.
In Fahrenheit 451, the problem was that books contained opinions or presented situations that offended different minorities of different races, professions, or any social groups, colored people, white people, smokers, dog lovers, cat lovers, doctors, lawyers, Chinese, Italians, Germans, Mexicans. This desire created the monstrous authoritarian state, something that social justice groups are doing today by demanding that the state acquire more authoritarian power in order to be able to impose more censorship. As it was impossible to write anything of value for fear of offending someone, books became so boring or stupid there was no longer reason to read them. It didn't come from the government down. No censorship to start with. No. Technology, mass exploitation, and minority pressure carried the trick. Among the sensitive minorities with regard to professional groups, the author could have added, along with doctors and lawyers, journalists, and secret agents, as President Trump has been criticized for offending their feelings too. As seen in Aldous Huxley's Brave New World earlier, and later Woody Allen's Orgasmatron, people themselves give up knowledge, books, or freedom in exchange for pleasures provided by the state. Television, drugs, at Roman times bread and circuses. In the book, written before television had become so commonplace, it is television that is the pleasure. As it has been said, the rich have big libraries, the poor have big television sets. Suppose today there were no internet video games. In order to play, someone must pay for the games, and further, suppose that the expense is considerable. Then the government proposes, give up your books and we will provide you with free video games for life, plus free drugs, sex, pop music, anything. Would many citizens today resist? Especially if the government gave people the right to play the role of rebel, scream and pretend to be a victim. As establishment insider Toynbee had said, The greatest accomplishment is to blur the lines between work and play. Do the government's bidding, but believe you are rebelling against the government. Give the state the right to ban free speech. Burning books and banning free speech are ultimately the same. By contrast, Hitler's Mein Kampf was legal in the United Kingdom during World War II, when the country was being bombed by Hitler. As Bradbury saw it, the right to offend is the basis of democracy. The right not to be offended is the basis of dictatorship. However, the author did make a mistake. In the book, he believes it is the educated from the best universities who will wish to preserve knowledge and free speech. But now it is students and professors of precisely these universities who wish to impose bans and censorship. One person pretended to be assembling a petition to ban the First Amendment so that conservatives can no longer present opinions that multiculturalists do not like.
American University by asking them to sign a petition to repeal the First Amendment to the U.S. Constitution, effectively giving up freedom of speech and other fundamental liberties.
What we're calling for is a petition to repeal the First Amendment. Just get rid of it. Blow it up.
I think this is fantastic.
Okay.
I absolutely agree.
Thank you.
Excellent.
Thank you.
Love it.
Thank you.
I'll sign it for you guys.
All right, I appreciate it.
I appreciate what you're trying to do.
I think the Constitution should be one big safe space, right? Hurt people's feelings.
Yeah, no.
Should not be protected speech.
Yeah.
So good for you. That's great.
Thank you. I appreciate it.
Good.
Man.
Amy Horowitz got over 50 people in 1 hour to sign the petition at Yale University.
When Bradbury himself attempted to explain to university students that the point of the book is not the government, but the people who abandon books for easy pleasures and accept censorship for the sake of sensitivity, the students were so narrow-minded that they refused to accept the writer's own interpretation of his book and thought they knew better. Finally, Bradbury felt forced to walk out on them. Not being able to say something, especially if the words are banned, results in not even being able to think it, something which may also constitute a crime. Without going so far back as the Catholic Church's list of forbidden books, in previous decades religious conservatives have attempted to ban or restrict literature, a television show, children's books, or place warnings on rock albums. Now, leftists are attempting to censor literature or cancel art exhibitions. A television show which was first criticized by the right was later cancelled by the left. Another television show criticized by the right today could not possibly have been made because of opposition from the left. Today, publishing houses hire sensitivity readers to detect any possible offensive ideas towards any group. If political correctness makes books of fiction timid, homogeneous, and dreary, the writer's own self-censorship being a key issue, then people abandoning books for other pleasures becomes more likely. If books become as mindless as other entertainment, then one will probably choose that which is at least more stimulating and easier. According to John Adams, third President of the United States, the Constitution of the country guaranteeing freedom is meant for people who have the values Americans had then. It was completely inappropriate for other people with different values. But if Americans or other democratic nations change values, they too will become people for whom freedom is inappropriate. They will become one of those nations for whom freedom is inappropriate. Citizens will want the government to restrict their fellow citizens' free speech, and if they reach the point of reacting violently every time someone offends them, then, as in other countries, in order to secure peace, the government will be forced to impose a dictatorship kind of rule. It may still be called democracy and there may still be elections, but this is the case in many dictatorships. The difference is whether there is free speech or forcible obedience to a dogma. Dictatorship may take different forms, but the result is the same. Liberty and respect. Liberty is the opposite of obligatory respect for all. Instead, liberty requires common sense as well. Supporting freedom of speech means exclusively supporting freedom of speech for opinions you completely disagree with and do not wish to hear. One issue is when people are encouraged to feel more and more easily outraged, what the result is going to be, how they will behave. The other is when entrusting the government with more and more power, what the result is going to be on how the state treats citizens. And if this is the evolution of the state, regarding the evolution of citizens, how long will it take for this to turn to this? But what if there are good intentions behind it? Of all tyrannies, a tyranny sincerely exercised for the good of its victims may be the most oppressive. The moral busybodies, those who torment us for our own good, will torment us without end, for they do so with the approval of their own conscience, without feelings of guilt, as they will believe it is the right thing to do. To be cured against one's will, and cured of states which we may not regard as disease, is to be classified along with children, idiots, and pets. The summary of Voltaire's beliefs, often misattributed to the thinker himself, is a belief that the hypersensitive fanatics would actually declare to be akin to fascism. Spoofs aside, regarding how far sensitivity and political correctness can be taken, a man was arrested for making a dog hail giving a Nazi salute as a joke. Supposedly showing your own country's flag puts foreigners at a disadvantage. The Virgin Mary is offensive. Dressing as a crusader is offensive. Is saying Merry Christmas offensive? In Sweden, any excuse is used, including disrespect, which has nothing to do with incitement to violence, and in Canada, this may include passages of the Bible. A top scientist had to apologize for wearing a shirt with cartoons of sexy women. A Nobel Prize-winning scientist lost his university position because he said that sometimes women cry when they are criticized, and then a leftist feminist accused him. And the man who discovered DNA lost his position because he said there are racial differences in IQ scores, something even his accusers admitted, but they merely added that for them the reasons are social. Today people, especially the young, feel disadvantaged, underprivileged, wronged, mistreated, and offended despite living infinitely better than white children who worked as coal miners 100 years ago, or black children suffering from hunger and diseases in Africa today, or the really underprivileged in their own societies. This transgender girl, born a boy, feels offended if not allowed to use the girls' showers at school, and perhaps believes to be as equally offended as this man when denied the right to vote. And why should one be upset in the West? Because in the past women, minorities, and gays were treated unfairly? But the West was the first to give equality to all. Anyone should feel lucky in the West compared to those in other places. All they have to complain about is that some conservatives may not like them. But imagine Western minorities living in other societies and how they would fare there. The West appears to be tolerant of many things, while the offended complainers do not appear to be as sensitive towards others as they claim to be. And finally, are all these people truly sensitive and offended? They were not offended when presidents of both parties orchestrated wars, killing 500,000 people each time. When this was happening in Syria, they were in deep philosophical thought over other issues that were more important to them than the deaths of 500,000 people. They were not upset when they learned that politicians and the police had conspired to keep secret the rapes of 1,400 teenage girls from poor families in one small town of the United Kingdom alone in order to protect the rapists and thus protect multiculturalism. Social justice activists may believe that these people's feelings count more than these people's lives. Western civilization in its entirety is based on offending people. Democracy offended the aristocracy. Science, the heliocentric theory, offended the church. Women voting offended narrow-minded men. The most important political and scientific writings were essentially attacks on the establishment. If these opinions were tolerated by the establishment itself, even barely, and even only in some countries back then, but opinions are not tolerated now by mere political minorities, it must mean that either these political groups are more intolerant than the old regimes, or that they are now more powerful. The second is not the case, but they are made powerful, obviously not on their own, but by the establishment itself, which allows them and encourages them to intimidate or attack their fellow citizens with some ulterior motive on the part of the establishment, the man. Compared to the rebel in Demolition Man, who did not want big government telling him how to live and did not want to take control of the government himself and tell others how to live, these people are the exact opposite. Imposing their opinions upon others does not make these people ungovernable. It just shows they wish to become the government, an authoritarian government that will impose its dogma on the people and then force them to obey, tell them what they may or may not say. They may not be the 1%, the establishment, but they are working for it as if they were its employees. While violence used to stop speeches is condemned by those who understand the results of violence and censorship, when such violence appeared to stop far-right speeches, some were very happy about this, because by whatever means necessary, nasty people must be silenced. This writer was not bothered by the fact that the people doing the silencing are not only equally nasty and extreme, but more violent. The fact that she welcomes violent attackers and considers them to be a part of her political side is the problem. If words by extremists must be answered not with words but with violence, will she or others not eventually reach the point of believing that words by non-extremists who simply disagree with them must also be answered with violence? Students from the left have banned speeches by conservatives, atheists, and leading feminists or gay activists because they believed in free speech, as well as a host of leftist comedians. In the past, the followers of the church burnt so-called witches. Now the followers of the media, the new church, demand the equivalent, silencing people whom the media told them to oppose. After the fake accusation of witch, now there are the fake accusations of racist, sexist, homophobic, offensive, which are enough to silence someone, as these words have the power of the old accusation of witch. Most of the time, people do not spontaneously demand censorship unless some organization puts them up to it. Without such support, the demand for censorship does not become normalized. McCarthy had partial support, but mostly a lot of opposition from the media, so his attempts were very limited. And even that was with regard to an enemy so determined that it had killed over 20 million of its own people, not with regard to hurt feelings or disagreements over political choices. During this period, the Communist Party remained legal in the United States, and only 12,000 people lost their jobs, mostly in the military or Hollywood. No different from what is happening now to people on the other side who are fired or blacklisted. And these people do not support their country's enemy, a state that killed 20 million people. Thus, present-day blacklisting is more unjustifiable. After all, these extremists are condemned and can easily be fired today for supporting an ideology that killed millions in the past and for supporting a state that does not pose a danger today. But these communists were supporting a state that was a danger and an ideology that was killing millions in what was at that time the present. Often it is the strong who have the support of the powerful who are the ones most against free speech, while the side that is weak seeks refuge in the right to free speech. In the past, it was conservatives who wanted restrictions and the moderates and left who wanted more freedom of expression, while now that the media support the left, it is the left that wants restrictions. In the United States, recent surveys show that older people support free speech more than the younger generations, and that conservatives support free speech more than leftists. In Europe, things are worse, as half the population supports restrictions. Recent surveys show that over half of university students would support restrictions and prohibitions on speech that is called hate speech. The problem is that then any powerful organized interest group could categorize a person's opinion as hate speech, and it would be banned, as it would be banned at different times or places if it was categorized as blasphemy, unpatriotic, etc. Still, this is a minority within the left. Most people on the left still oppose politically correct restrictions. Blacks and other minorities claim to oppose political correctness as much as whites. But the more educated and rich people are, the less they oppose political correctness. It is indicative that, with the exception of the extremely conservative, it is leftist activists who are the most nearly exclusive racially homogeneous white group in the country. But if, for example, the fanatics are 100 people, all 100 will protest. If the moderates are 1,000, only 20 will demonstrate. Thus, because fanatics are so annoying and create such problems, university authorities may choose to give them what they want, but they give them an inch and they take a mile. The next time, they demand something even more extreme. Sometimes, though, university authorities may secretly support such protesters because they too wish to impose the same beliefs by force. When Trump was elected president, university students claimed they were so upset that they faced psychological problems and could not study, so they should be allowed to pass the exams without writing the exams. Some examinations were made optional. Administrators also provided students with psychological counselors who offered them Play-Doh to express their frustration with, and specially trained dogs to calm them. Dogs, which are typically used with children who have been traumatized by rape or whose parents died. Other people their age fight in wars. Imagine living in a house built by an architect or undergoing surgery performed by a surgeon who has not taken their exams because they were upset, but were given their diplomas out of sensitivity.
Every moment of this day, I hear, is that people are afraid. They're scared. There's this pit in the bottom of my stomach that will not go away. And I'm terrified.
Donald J. Trump is now President of the United States. President Obama Mr. Trump, for the moment, steps to listen for the inaugural address.
What a great honor to be able to introduce for the first time ever anywhere the 45th President of the United States of America, Donald.
How far does the politically correct desire to ban free speech extend? Consider.
Last month, Evergreen State College in Washington went crazy. when a professor of evolutionary biology named Brett Weinstein objected to a day of absence when white students and faculty were asked to voluntarily leave campus. Weinstein branded it a form of racial segregation. A group of student protesters called him a racist. He describes himself as deeply progressive.
We just wanted to be like, until you're accountable for these actions, you don't get to teach students at Evergreen. We would like Brett to be fired, but that isn't happening. The administration is refusing to take action. They're choosing to protect this white, cis male professor over its students.
I mean, essentially sounded like you're being held hostage there. If you were going to go to the bathroom, you had to go with 2 escorts? Is that true?
That's what the students felt was true.
The situation on campus grew even more inflamed after Weinstein went on Fox News.
Although Brett has not personally said, go out and attack these students, go out and threaten these students, that has been the result of his actions. He has incited white supremacists, and he has validated white supremacists and Nazis in our community and in the nation. And I don't think that should be protected by free speech.
We received a threat saying that people will come here and execute every single person they see on campus. At that point, fuck free speech.
When we're dead, when people die, and you're sitting here like, well, at least they got to practice their free speech. I'm so sorry about it. Your free speech is not more important than the lives of like black, trans, femmes, and students on this campus. I'm so sorry. I hate to break it to you.
Love you. She is not saying that people should be forbidden to say, on a scale of more racist to less racist to completely anti-racist, minorities are bad, or minorities are good but not as good as whites, or minorities are great and just as good as whites. She is saying you do not have the right to say minorities are great but whites should not be punished for their color. The idea is a professor should not be allowed to appear on television and say that he thinks whites should not be excluded from their university, their workplace, because some students decided to impose a No White People Day. This is what should not be covered by free speech, because she thinks speaking on television may incite or validate white supremacy. Of course, everything is in her imagination. What she calls white supremacy is not white supremacy at all, but simply something logical, not being kept out of your workplace because of your color. But simply believing this, in her opinion, gives her the right to ban any speech at all. Insisting on going to your workplace while white means you are supporting the Nazis, because you disagree with a decision made by 20 or 50 students. If you disagree with me, you are a Nazi means I am so perfect that it is unacceptable for anyone to disagree with me. As long as spoiled brats have the support of sympathetic professors, powerful media, and easily brainwashed people who refuse to condemn them vocally, there is encouragement for more people to become irrational, who, as they are university students, are going to be the future judges, politicians, lawmakers, and censors. By the way, trying to ban and fire professors over this may result in ugly comments against these people, but this is the result of their intolerance. And in reality, they are winning. Professors or chancellors do get fired in such cases. Causes may include issues such as the fact that someone drew a swastika in the snow. But students do not get violently attacked as they claim to fear. Not to mention that, unlike opinions, which are always a part of free speech, no matter what the opinion is, personal threats are a police matter and should not be lumped together with opinions in order to discredit free speech.
I was even more surprised by the protesters' fervor in shouting down my actual students, some of whom had known me for years. The cruelty and derision reserved for students of color who spoke in my defense was particularly troubling. What I had not counted on was their alliance with Evergreen's new president. Though the protesters openly humiliated him, the president of the college partnered with the mob in private, handing them concession after concession. In that same video, the president speaks of his plan for those who resist the new order. Bring them in, train them, and if it doesn't take, sanction them. What I have seen functions much more like a cult, in which the purpose is only understood by the leaders, and the rest have been seduced into a carefully architected fiction. This is now extending into the classroom And it's a question of what one can properly teach in a biology class, for example, which may well not be politically correct, but is nonetheless necessary for students to understand the organism that they're studying. If we decide that there are certain things that are true in science that can't be stated in a college classroom,
this case alone shows racism on the part of the protesters, authoritarianism, a cult controlled from above, being against even scientific truth. Yet, some are not convinced that Bradbury predicted this, but insist on calling him racist because he opposed the desire for censorship coming from all races and all professions. Political correctness at universities is studied in this article that later became a book. Leftist student activists demand that their law professors stop teaching about rape law or even using words like violate because that could upset students that had suffered sexual assault. This is like teaching a medical student to be a surgeon without mentioning or showing blood, and the future surgeon is someone who is afraid of blood. Microaggression is anything anyone wishes to imagine. Some students demand their professors give them trigger warnings before teaching literature that contains violence, so students who have suffered violence may prepare themselves or leave the classroom in case the book brings back memories. Lists of microaggressions to be avoided were presented to university deans. The list included statements like, "America is the land of opportunity." The idea that words or anything else can bring back memories of a terrible event is known from soldiers returning from war. It is now called post-traumatic stress disorder, but this is a mental disease. Political correctness means making everyone mentally ill, so everyone will behave like they suffer from this mental disease. If I feel something is true, then everyone must believe it is true. If this is my subjective perception, everyone must accept it as the objective truth. If I feel someone's words offended me, then he must apologize or be punished by some authority. The concept being imposed is policing speech and punishing speakers. So, who will be doing the policing? Obviously, the most vicious people who enjoy creating trouble for others and enjoy the sense of power, authority over other people, whom they can humiliate or threaten. They would be volunteer gulag guards or volunteer concentration camp guards. Unlike the actual guards who were simply sent to these posts by their superiors, these politically correct activists would enthusiastically choose the task on their own. These people are not sensitive protectors, but heartless abusers. Professors receive phone calls from deans and other administrators investigating complaints from students because they taught something in class that included triggering information without first giving the students a trigger warning. The easiest way for professors to avoid trouble is not to teach the material that some students do not wish to learn about. The lesson and discussion must be adjusted to the subjective perceptions and mentality of that one student who is the most subjective and mentally unstable. The entire class must be lowered to the lowest common denominator. The student government in one college proposed the creation of an anonymous reporting system for microaggressions so that there would be disciplinary action against those they considered to be oppressors. Of course, it is some sort of authority that will impose the punishment. The result of politically correct protection is to increase the power of the state that will prosecute offenders or any type of authority that will impose rules on speech. They do this now because the authoritarian impositions will be in their favor and against the other side. It is known that people cannot resist the temptation of using power and acquiring more power. When administrative bodies are encouraged to usurp more power, more authority, exercise more control, rule and dictate unto others, they cannot resist the temptation. When a bureaucrat is encouraged to become a dictator, he will do so. The federal government greatly increased this problem in its extended form. Before, in order for speech to be considered to be sexual harassment, it had to be objectively offensive, meaning reasonable people would have to consider it offensive. But since 2013, this changed. Even comments considered unwelcome would constitute harassment. It became possible that anyone could claim anything subjectively and threaten the university if it did not take action to stop this offense. Fear of federal investigations led universities to overdo it and define as harassment anything that any irrational person could subjectively imagine to be harassment. Universities accept emotional reasoning as evidence. The article ends by suggesting the most important ways to solve the problem. The federal government must free the universities from the fear they are placed under, that they will be investigated for ridiculous reasons and then punished. These very suggestions prove that these people should consider the problem to be mostly the fault of the people in high positions and not the fault of the activists, the bottom feeders. This means that it is the elites that do not simply allow the activists to create the problem, but actually create the problem themselves and then encourage activists to make a fuss, essentially using the activists as tools, as an excuse to do what they had planned all along. Bradbury himself explained that science fiction allows one to criticize communism, racism, and fascism without appearing to be teaching, that both majorities and minorities may wish to exercise their tyranny in order to control people, that political correctness is the enemy, it is thought control and free speech control, and that his point was not an attempt to predict the future, but to prevent it. When tricky people convince others, especially the young, that they should fear and hate blacks, or fear Jews, or fear gays, or fear Trump, and fear for their lives, this creates overreactions.
White supremacist and a vice president. Our nation is divided. We have been assaulted. It's an act of terrorism. One of the most frightening things for me and most people in my life is that the people committing the assault are among them.
People are going to die because of what happened. And if we don't start that, we cannot have a conversation. People's lives are on the line now, and it's time we got real about that.
Are we certain that these professors did not desire to create violence to overthrow the system and play the role of rebel well after their adolescence has passed? The absolutism among the easily offended and their protectors leads to the belief that they have the right to do anything in order to stop offense. They can get people fired from their jobs or violently attack them. Powerful interests have always used useful idiots to do their bidding and use them to achieve power by eliminating the other side. They may organize them themselves or simply allow them to commit violence if this is of benefit to their cause, and offer excuses to justify this violence. When people reach the point of being afraid to react, when the state itself has a motive to enforce such obedience, absolute conformity leads to even mental slavery. In North Korea, when the dictator dies, the people must cry hysterically, non-stop, because the cameras are watching. As Orwell had predicted in his book 1984, the people must put on a good show, because if they do not cry enough, the dictatorship will consider them disloyal to the state. The problem with not offending people is that these people, who will never be criticized, will not grow up and live as normal people, whose beliefs and actions are governed partly by the response of their surroundings, but will believe themselves to be perfect, and will become arrogant and believe that they have the right to impose by force any idea that comes in their mind, because they are superior. They may complain about white supremacy, but they are the supremacy of the uncriticized and the unoffended. As Bakunin had written, even if we leave all decisions to the experts, the most educated and knowledgeable, these people will become arrogant, as power corrupts and absolute power corrupts absolutely. Those who attain the right to dictate to others become privileged, and privilege corrupts. And we will become stupid, because we will merely obey their decisions and not think on our own. Now, imagine the same, but instead of experts, the power to make all decisions as to who has the right to speak and which opinion is correct and may be voiced is given to fanatic, malignantly narcissistic brats and career-driven people who would do anything to please the powerful so that they will fund their political, judicial, or activist career. This person stated, "Free speech is not more important than the lives of black transgender people." No, freedom and democracy were considered more important than the lives of millions of soldiers who were sent to fight and often die in the war against Hitler. What makes this person so special that we have to sacrifice freedom for their safety? We have not sacrificed free speech to protect Jews from Muslims, or to protect Muslims from anti-Muslims, or to protect blacks from whites, or whites from blacks, or gays from Christians. Firing a professor because he spoke on television and someone felt offended and threatened is the opposite of the very foundation on which the United States was built. Let us suppose that these politically correct ideologues are correct on everything. Should people want violent leftist gangs to threaten anyone who has a different opinion or attack them when they go to political gatherings? Simply consider the fact that if these perfect ideologues in the future prove to be bad, there will be no way to stop them, because disagreement will be impossible. Gangs will make it practically impossible, and eventually laws will forbid it. This was the problem with Hitler and Stalin. It was not mostly their policies and beliefs. The effects of Nazism and communism could have been stopped with the next elections, but there were no real next elections. It was authoritarianism and prohibition of free speech that brought the catastrophes. The all-powerful government could arrest, imprison, execute at will. This is why the worst danger is not racism, sexism, homophobia, or Islamophobia. The worst danger is the limitations on free speech. Concentration camps and gulags were made possible not because of Nazi racism or communist collectivism. Many Western countries were fully racist then. Politicians, teachers, journalists, and scientists believed in white supremacy, yet they did not kill people for their race or color. Many Western countries have implemented socialist policies, but did not accompany them with gulags. Racism and collectivism have made societies worse, unfair, shameful, or have led to economic collapse. But racism and collectivism 99% of the time do not kill. Lack of free speech does. Hitler's views were not very different from those of other Western prime ministers and presidents at the time who felt justified in occupying all of Africa because they viewed the people there as inferior. The biggest problem with Nazism was not its social and racial ideology. It was wrong, as were the prevailing ideologies in other countries, and more extreme than that of the others, but this alone would simply have produced more unfairness and annoyance. The big problem was its authoritarianism, prohibition of free speech and imposition of only one view, and the establishment of an all-powerful state. This is what made the difference between unfairness that could be overcome and actual mass murder. Hateful racism in a democracy is not a big problem. The Ku Klux Klan has caused no trouble over the last 50 years in the United States. It is the lack of democracy that is the problem. Notice that the Ku Klux Klan could commit crimes only at the time and those places where there was less democracy, where blacks could not vote or speak freely. Lack of democracy is a problem even if the ideology is a supposedly good ideology. Consider how supposedly humanitarian socialism became the horror of Soviet communism in the context of a dictatorship, while socialism in the context of a democracy did not kill millions or even one person in Sweden. The anti-racist dictatorship in the Soviet Union killed 20 million people. Obviously, anti-racist feelings alone do not prevent mass murder or arresting and imprisoning millions. Anti-racism has to be combined with democratic feeling in order to prevent catastrophe. If undemocratic people are anti-racists, this does not justify their actions and does not mean they are safe. They are a danger, and their anti-racism does not make them less dangerous. Thus, Hitler's racism was shameful and made some people's lives worse, but it was his dictatorship, the lack of democracy, that killed millions. This is the lesson to people today who disregard the democracy or dictatorship issue and focus only on the racism or anti-racism issue. Democracy and free speech are the priority. As for terrorism, in a democracy like the United States, individual white terrorists killing minorities or blacks killing whites over racist reasons are a real fact, but these are around 1 or 2% of all murders in the country. In a dictatorship, the political murders are nearly all the murders. The media calls one of the two violent sides anti-racist, but the true terms are Nazis and communists, supporters of ideologies that have killed tens of millions. If the rich owners of the media appear to be friendly to this side, although it is the side that typically starts the attacks, it must mean they have found a way to use these people to their advantage. Sometimes the elites may support one extreme or the other, but whoever wins, it is democracy that loses. Groups that oppose free speech for the other side may or may not prove to be a danger to democracy, but those who support free speech for all have never threatened democracy. One difference between Fahrenheit 451 and the reality of the present is that things are worse in reality concerning offensiveness. In the book, a citizen cannot insult anyone. There is no distinction according to race, for example, because it was a post-racist society where the concept of race was irrelevant. All races were the same and equally protected. However, in our society, a citizen cannot offend minorities, but can offend the majority. Whites, heterosexuals, Christians, and men, even though they are not the majority, and especially anyone who is a white Christian heterosexual red meat-eating man. Likewise, regarding professions, journalists and secret agents are considered protected species, and it is wrong to criticize them. But criticizing, ridiculing, or hating police officers or soldiers is all right. However, it has nothing to do with the majority. Even in areas where whites are minorities, the same rule applies. There, it is claimed, a minority is a group that has suffered historical injustice, so all whites, including the homeless, are privileged, while all blacks, including the millionaires, are underprivileged. But even this does not apply. The vast majority of Hispanics and East Asians arrived after civil rights legislation, so have suffered no injustice. As a matter of fact, East Asians make more money than whites. Yet they are still categorized as potential underprivileged victim groups. So, if they are 30% of the population, they count as minorities, while if whites are 30%, they do not. The reason the definition of what a minority is important is that only minorities can have free speech. The designation of victim group is akin to being the new moral aristocracy. If we agreed that everyone must have free speech, then definitions would not matter. Consider the traditional old-fashioned churches that do not accept homosexuality. They believe that homosexuality is a sin, but also believe that 99% of heterosexuals are sinners because they have sex outside marriage. Thus, both kinds of sinners can go to such a church. Priests or ministers do not try to change their lifestyle, and they do not try to change the church dogmas. They tolerate and respect each other. But gay activists want to impose changes, feeling offended by the idea of sinner. The equivalent would be heterosexuals trying to force the church to accept sex outside marriage. Likewise, although some churches tolerate these sins and simply disregard them, other churches focus great attention on them, condemnation, and attempt to change gays. It's the same mentality on both sides. Change gays or change the church. The politically correct desire for censorship is a religion, a faith. A religion may be intolerant, as when witches were burnt, or tolerant, Now, the vast majority of Christians accept their atheist neighbor, but those faithful to the politically correct religion do not accept their fellow citizens who are not politically correct, but instead attempt to prevent them from speaking or attempt to get them fired from their jobs. While the feminist movement has changed very much, on the outside the demand is the right to be half naked, but the focus is on changing not laws or achieving equality, but affecting how people think. Men must not look at women a certain way or think of women a certain way. It's a thought police. It may look free and libertine, but it is actually restrictive, limited to a dogma, as conservative and puritanical as the old dogma was 200 years ago. Not conservative politically, but in the desire to conform to a social dogma. Obedience to a dogma ends up like a cult. This may be why there is so little logic here. People who have stopped attempting to force others to conform to their dogma admit their politically correct social justice struggle was like a cult, and by shaming or condemning people with a different opinion, they felt pleasure every time they called someone a sexist or racist. It would explain the lack of logic. Historical films may be criticized for not having enough blacks at a time and place where there were no blacks, or criticized for not having overweight people at a time when there was hardly anyone obese, as people were starving.
And you can say it was a real love match. We married for money. Am I shrinking, Violet? Say, it wouldn't hurt you to shrink 30 or 40 pounds.
Oh, you impudent.
I can see you right now in the kitchen, bending over a hot stove. But I can't see the stove. Is it true you're getting a divorce as soon as your husband recovers his eyesight?
This lady is my wife. You should be ashamed.
If this lady is your wife, you should be ashamed. Remember, you're fighting for this woman's honor, which is probably more than she ever did.
Why, I've never been so insulted in my life.
Well, it's early yet.
The policeman from the past agrees with the rebel because he came directly from the past and had not been subjected to the recent brainwash. Likewise, if a left-leaning liberal from the 60s stepped in a time machine and came directly to the present without being subjected to the politically correct media brainwash of the past few decades, he would have found the present situation insufferable, and today's politically correct social justice activists would call him a racist, sexist Nazi. Unimaginable for college students demanding less free speech and demanding that comedians censor their jokes in order not to offend anyone. Unimaginable for colleges to impose regulations according to which a male student must ask a female student he is on a date with if she wants to be kissed and get clear permission. Otherwise, attempting to kiss her, even if the boy stops, counts as sexual assault and perhaps even attempted rape. And he must ask for permission for every hug or touch, and on the next date he must ask again for new permission for another kiss, etc. What true leftist would not find it suspicious that big companies support multiculturalism with such intensity and ban those who disagree? Perhaps these companies have good motives, so multiculturalists should welcome their support. But if a leftist is always suspicious of big business, shouldn't he remain so, just in case this newfound friend has ulterior motives? If these people want to limit free speech, it means they want the state to do this, because only the state has the authority to enforce prohibitions. Do they want to give such power to the state? Do they trust the state with such power? Keeping in mind that they are saying this at a time that the state is in the hands of President Trump, whom they claim to fear. Supposed anti-racist laws that would forbid criticizing minorities could also be used to forbid minority groups from criticizing the majority. Do minorities wish to have less free speech? Keeping in mind that the equality they achieved was precisely in part because of free speech and the right to protest, criticize, and condemn the majority. The ideal of free speech is not inherent in human nature. It is imposed by culture created by our betters, just as acceptance of a government we dislike is because we have learned to tolerate majority rule. Our fellow citizens now and in the past, if given the chance, would have banned pornography, heavy metal, communist literature, or racist jokes. Societies that are not raised in this culture, as soon as they are set free from an oppressive dictatorship, free to do as they wish, choose to follow fanatics and attack, kill, massacre. Even when they are a small minority of the population, the majority just keeps quiet and allows these active minorities to take control. The institution of free speech protects a society from such active, dynamic minorities. Conservative protesters likening Obama to Hitler or Stalin were relatively few and were even seen smiling. They may know that this is not the truth. They appear calm, some may even be joking, criticizing by means of ridicule. But these leftist protesters presenting Trump as Hitler are far more, and they are furious, enraged, upset, with open mouths, to the point of being hysterical, because they truly believe Trump is Hitler. This is because the media have convinced them about this, meaning the extremely rich owners of the media have convinced them. Thus, by actually being so upset and believing something so extreme, they are acting as obedient servants to the extremely rich. Consider, the media did not tell citizens every day that the wars Obama and Hillary designed killed 500,000 people. So there was no reason for the media to tell citizens every day that they, as journalists, believe Trump is a racist. It was adults that made 5-year-old kindergarten children in Australia chant, "We hate Trump." Anyone can convince children to hate others, to kill, to believe that Trump is Hitler, or that the sky is falling. Emotionalism places children in suits of armor that protects them from the truth and logic. If there is no logic, who is served by this result? Most likely the people who created the result. Some Americans think that their presidents are the same as Hitler or Stalin, simply because they disagree with their policies, but they are merely insulting the real victims of these dictators. Leaving the wars aside, regarding domestic policy, Obamacare or deportations are a matter of policy and choice and not proof of dictatorship. After all, one way or another, the government has been involved in healthcare and carrying out deportations for decades upon decades, and this from both sides. Republicans raised taxes to support Medicare, and Democrats voted in favor of different walls along the border. Disagreeing with a policy does not justify hysteria and believing it is the end of the world. American presidents so far may deserve plenty of criticism on different issues, and if one despises their policies, it is all right to despise them. But they have not acted as Nazis or communists yet. It is up to the people themselves to also choose not to act in such a way. The people's adherence to moderation forces politicians to appeal to moderates. Adherence to extremism convinces politicians to appeal to the extremists. If the people become even worse than their politicians, all is lost.